Hi, good day everyone. Hi, Gladstone. My name is Dr. Nahan, clinical psychologist, psychotherapist, speech and language therapist, and we are recording an episode for Spectrum Talk and Tips. And I'm from
Right.
Pakistan, and I have a very amazing guest. And the moment I get her message, and that was very interesting because today we are going to learn about a very important aspect of autistic journey, and that is about reading, that is about writing, that is about how you are able to not able to understand if a shape of something is changed. That is very interesting for me. So thank you so much, Kate,
Yes.
for coming today.
Thank you. So I should tell you a bit about myself. First off, I might as well begin with a list of my diagnoses, not in the order that they were made, but the order in which they come to mind. Since you began by mentioning reading and writing, I'll start with what I like to call the DYS abilities: dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyspraxia, all of which I've been diagnosed with, even though I was quite an early reader, which is not usual for people who later get diagnosed with dyslexia, which I was as an adult. It was all very compensatory in that even though I could read very early, I could read things like, headlines in newspapers and, words on the cornflakes boxes and that sort of thing. I did not know that it wasn't normal for me to have to mentally straighten these out before I read them, and that it wasn't normal for me to be as uncertain as I was. In my case, not so much about the letters themselves, what is A, what is B, but the fact that there are different type fonts and styles, and some of them can look very different. If you look at any word in a printed book or newspaper that has, let's say, lowercase printed A or a lowercase printed G, these look very different if you've ever noticed when they are written even in a printed style versus the way that they are in most type fonts. Now, I remember being unsure, are these new letters, are these extra letters, and I've got to learn them too? Are they the same letter? And people thinking, that this was a ridiculous question, that everyone else seemed to just know, how could I be able to read quite a lot of things, even to try to sound out the occasional thing I saw that, was in the Roman alphabet, but was in the language other than English? How could I do that and be uncertain whether if I saw the word goat, Goat, in the storybook, if that G was a G, if that A was an A, is the T the same letter when it's got, the little flick up on the end, that sort of thing? Are they different letters because parts of them tend to be thick and thin in type fonts and obviously not in our handwriting? Now, I got in a lot of trouble with that. The dysgraphia, the dyspraxia, to be non-technical, dyspraxia is a lack of, it's a severe clumsiness. It's a lack of aptitude with moving one's hands, with doing a lot of fine motor precision things, no matter how you practice, no matter what is supposed to aid you, even though, I do a fair amount of crafts. I do things like calligraphy. It took me literally decades to get to the point where I could do calligraphy or even, very, very simple needlework or this kind of thing, even though I very much wanted. And even though it was very important to some of the teachers at the schools where I went, and one of my aunts whom I loved very much, my great aunt, in fact, was very good, and I wanted to be good, and I just really made a botch and, disappointed my poor dear great aunt Shirley. Well, in terms of dysgraphia, as the name might, suggest to those of us who have gotten into, Greek vocabulary and that sort of thing, that is specifically an issue with writing, with, in my case, making the pen do what you want to do, particularly when you have what we normally have in the USA, which is not only having, a wide variety of different type fonts and so on, which they have everywhere, but the typical procedure in the USA was, and I would say still is, where handwriting is taught at all, that, you're doing this circle and stick thing for, perhaps 2 or 3 years, from the time you're 5 until, grade 2, you would say year 2 or year 3, grade 2 or grade 3, we would say, all of a sudden you come into school one morning, after the weekend, and all of a sudden, well, while you were gone, they changed the alphabet. Instead of all these circles and six, which are difficult in terms of formation, even though they're clear to see, all of a sudden you got, squiggly wigglies all over the place,
Yeah.
and people are telling you, well, this is the same. And well, just memorize this. Now, some letters one could guess at or memorize, a capital K. It's got a few little squigglies on it, but one could see it was a K. But if you've ever seen typical American copybook styles, the letter G does not look like anything you would imagine is a letter G at all. It looks like a sort of square little box with ribbons. And, and if you wonder, well, why? How could this even be a G? I should probably get out some paper and show you at some point, but I don't feel like getting up right now when I've just sat down. I will
That,
probably show you
like,
my book when
yeah,
I wrote
yes, you have book.
much later. We'll get that because that was years off. I would just say, well, like, why does this make any sense? And one doesn't want to say that, even though in most schools in the USA you were not caned or anything like that. Well, they have other ways, that there are always other ways the teacher can punish you, one of which is to ridicule you and to encourage the other children often to do the same. They're not supposed to encourage other children to ridicule you, but there are teachers who will do that. And I was told over and over again that I must be really stupid, and that if I was the sort of person who could get a lot of things right, who could remember a lot of facts, who could spell words aloud if, there was a spelling test, or an oral spelling contest, a spelling bee, as we say, if I could spell words aloud, but not necessarily in writing because no one could read it, there had to be something wrong with me. And I remember being told again and again that I was a very stupid person who had somehow managed cleverly to look smart. Now, don't ask me what sense that makes, because I did ask what sense that made. And of course, I was punished for it. I was sent to the principal's office, as you would say, the headmaster's office, so often that, I knew the staff there on a first name basis. I probably saw more of them than I saw of some of my family members. Not that I necessarily liked it. I did go to more than one school. Even though I did very well in most of my subjects, most of my assignments, there would be the occasional thing I failed. Anything with writing was horrendous. Even if it was something like, write 5 sentences of facts that you have learned about George Washington, the first president of the United States. I remember, wishing that, George Washington had been named something different. That's a really long name to write. Why couldn't he be named Bill Smith? And why couldn't, and why does his name have to start with that horrible, horrible, horrible G? Why? It seemed as if the universe and the very language itself was conspiring against me. Now, keep in mind, I was not diagnosed. I was simply someone going through an extremely, extremely tough situation. The best is, in other words, I had every disability. I was not diagnosed. I mentioned 3 of them, also undiagnosed, and none of these were diagnosed until various points in my adulthood. So besides the big 3 Ds, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia, well, I have a couple of these in there too. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity syndrome, and autism. At one point diagnosed as Asperger's, but they changed the diagnosis standards, and they changed it actually about, I have a light that goes on a timer, and it changes colors at night to encourage me to sleep, but tonight I don't want to. So I'm going to tell my computer to put it on. Alexa, work lights. Just wait so I don't have to look all purple for you. Now it'll stay up the way I like it for a couple of hours. I will tell you, by the way, one of my biggest compensatory strategies is get that Amazon Echo, get those devices, because they will do so much that you say, and they'll even, look up things like recipe quantities, math or that sort of thing. Since I have friends in other countries besides the US, I'm often having to convert things from the English system to the metric system. If we're talking about the weather and what temperature it is, I could look it up or run it on my calculator, but I don't want to remember that. And since you can talk to an Amazon Echo device, it can be one of your best friends. But all of that was many years in the future. That would have been science fiction when I was a little girl. And I was, so, well, don't be that science fiction, all of that stuff that doesn't help you deal with reality. As it happened, I learned some of my best strategies in life from reading science fiction and learning about the adventures of alien beings trying to cope on Earth, or human beings trying to cope with strange aliens who could not be understood. And of course, a lot of science fiction deals with just very difficult situations and just getting by. I don't want to say too much about my family, except to say that my father appears to have had all of my difficulties, perhaps slightly less. I'd say about 90%, but still definitely there. He understood me, but was frustrated. Remember, he had not been diagnosed with anything either. He had been born in 1931. Okay? Nobody, in other words, he was born into a world where, they were just beginning to find out a lot of things that we take for granted today. And, talking about, if anyone had said, well, someday you'll talk to a box and it will turn on and off your lights for you, and it will, make the window shades open and close at specified times, they would have thought that you were a lunatic. They would have sent you to be locked up. If someone had told me, or had told my parents that, one day people will have conversations by television and they won't be paying long distance fees, and someone in New York will be talking with someone in Pakistan, they would have said, you're crazy. And in the same way, if anyone had said, your daughter, that if someone had said to my father, especially my mother, both of them were teachers of English, but my mother, who did not really have any problems, was very perplexed about my problems. And, why can't someone who seems intelligent and who can, and who can remember a lot of facts that she's learned, and who can do a lot of things, and who can fix things around the house when they're broken. At one point I fixed, the drain in the shower, and I was 9, and my parents were amazed. How can she do all this? And if you write her own name in cursive, she can't read much of it. The G was a puzzler, the L was a puzzler. Other things weren't, but eventually you can, but a lot of it was. And of course, when I asked, can you show me how this makes any sense? It doesn't make any sense. Now, I will tell you that even after I began being diagnosed, the dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyspraxia were diagnosed when I was 17, but there really was no help. Interventions that were available were more of the same that hadn't worked for me. And except that now I was told, well, we now know you've got something wrong with you, and this stuff that we're doing, that we, if we give you, a book to help your handwriting or whatever, it's supposed to work. This is what, more of the same that you had, and it's supposed to work. And well, it bloody well didn't. And let's just say, if there's one thing worse than not knowing what's up with you, it's being told what's up with you, knowing that this is probably true, being given something or other that's supposed to be a sure cure, and it isn't, because, then where are you? Now, unfortunately, that is even more the case today than it was when I was, being diagnosed. And, and later on, the autism, Asperger's syndrome, which later they re-diagnosed as autism because they lost my medical records when my neurologist retired, and I went through the whole testing process again. And by this time, they had changed the definitions of, what was Asperger's and what was autism, So, and for that, there basically is still nothing except sort of, I won't say there's really nothing except grit your teeth and bear it, but there's precious little. But being told that now, even more than today, there are these notions going around, oh, if you just make them write in cursive and join all their letters, they won't have the reversals. They won't forget which way around the B is supposed to be or the D or something, and they won't have problems joining things up and arranging things in order. Well, I can tell you, not only did I have those problems, certainly in cursive, once it was emphasized and joining things together, if you're in an American classroom, at least in a school that still thinks about handwriting, which is not all schools, not all states, but a great many of them still, and back then it was universal. Well, let's say that growing up where I was, I thought, they're literally, making cursive handwriting into one of the 10 commandments, in other words, as you might see it, I suspect that there are many people in Pakistan who, when they deal with a copybook, I don't know about, Urdu, but, for English, I suspect that they deal with it and they think, they're making this stand with the 5 pillars of Islam as if there was a 6th pillar. And I just was like, well, let's just say that this was very frightening, particularly because even after, people sort of stopped caring what your handwriting looked like, or not caring as much, when you were a bit older, when when I was perhaps in my teens, okay, one was no longer graded on handwriting, but there was still the feeling that, at least a young lady, you've got to have good handwriting. You shouldn't have handwriting that looks as if it backed into the front end of a lawnmower. And of course, being told more and more over the years, as notions came up that, oh, cursive will cure everything, cursive will cure everything. Well, it made it worse. And I would point this out. And of course, I pointed out that the people telling me to join up all my letters and to not have any printed letters didn't do that themselves. And I was told, well, can't you see we don't? But I would say, I mean, one of the times it was sent to a principal was because I had dared to pull out a magnifying glass sometime in the 5th year of school, when I had a teacher who was very, very, well, if you don't write in cursive, you're very, very uncivilized, and you have to join all your letters, or, you're just a monkey or something. And I pointed out that, she did not, I had some comments on, return paper, please pay attention. We are big boys and girls now, and you've got to join our letters and not have print. And, she had, as many good fluent writers do, quite a lot of pen lifting in there to avoid difficult joins, quite a lot of, print-like letters where they were disagreeing with the cursive letters and were more efficient. She was very, she was doing all the things she told us not to do, and she didn't like, having this pointed out, how dare I come in with a magnifying glass and point out that, oh, in this very comment where you wrote, that I've got to join up all my letters, or I'm just, an uncivilized barbarian. Well, look what you're doing, ma'am. And, it was far easier for her to, just ridicule me and encourage others to do the same than to make my case. By the way, what I did to her was something that I do now routinely when I talk with adults, teachers or whatever. I'm doing a workshop and they give me a hard time about what I teach and why, and that I'm very into methods that allow a lot of printing, a lot of pen lifts, italic handwriting, as I'll get to in a moment, has been my mainstay. When I get into that, I get to do this, every time I talk to a rather skeptical teacher, or, in a way, I'm living out my greatest revenge fantasy, like it or not, in a way. But to get back to my childhood and teenhood difficulties, imagine going all the way through school and through college and graduate school, even though, okay, they didn't care about handwriting so much. And of course, eventually got a typewriter. Well, I had typewriters and played with them as a baby, with like my mommy's broken typewriter or something. At one point, they got an electronic word processor, when I was in college, graduate school. This, keep in mind, I'm nearly 60, so this was a long time ago. This was practically the Stone Age by modern standards. But eventually, so I eventually, okay, they want things typed, I can do that. I am not a great typist. I make a lot of mistakes, I love email, but my emails are a calamity because of the, motor control issues. I do a lot of proofreading and I miss things even so. I could do it, but what about reading the handwriting? We know what college professors' handwriting, among others, can look like. There were very few whose handwriting I could read. I really had to guess. I had to really read everything but what was on the board to make sense of the class. I had to ask a lot of questions. That might have helped me in the long run, but there are times, if something new is written on the board and you can't figure it out, even in the best of handwritings, never mind the very poor handwriting that many people develop after a certain amount of scribbling. And of course, I was going through a whole thing, graduate school. At one point, I love reading. I love books. And and they say dyslexics are not going to learn to read. Well, it's not true because I'm here. And so many dyslexics have written books, not only now, but throughout history. We may not find it as easy, but we do get there. And I will tell you, if nothing else, my father and mother, both being English teachers, understood very well, reading. They were very helpful. And I was actually reading quite a lot before I got to school. So, which was one reason it took that long to be diagnosed. When I was diagnosed, it turned out I was dyslexic, all right, but I had been compensating, and you're not supposed to know how to do that. But I did know how to do that. Yay, me. But anyway, at one point I hit bottom, and the thing happened to me when I was 24. I was in my 24th year, and this changed my life. And this was actually right as I was heading into library, I was heading into, library science school. I did eventually get my master's in library science, but it was after a very shaky and dodgy college career. My major had been linguistics, and I was a sort of student who gets perhaps a B minus average because a lot of my grades are A and a lot of my grades are F, which is failure, or D, which is basically as close to failure as you can come without being a failure. There was really nothing in between. Anyway, I had a lot of studying to do. I stayed at home when other people were out having fun. And one of the things that happened when I stayed home, I had to take phone messages every so often, because although we had an answering machine, those were the old ones with the little piece of tape in there, the little cassette tape, and it would very often break. Mm-hmm. And when it broke, I had to write things down. It would, at one point I was at home studying for an examination or something, and there was a party coming up. I forget the details, but mom or dad was organizing some kind of event. It was probably mom, because there was always seemed to be a wedding or, something coming up. And people were calling in like, oh, and Uncle Abe called, he can't come. And Shirley called, she's coming. This one called, he can't come, she is coming, but, she'll be a little late because whatever. Now, normally we would let it go onto the machine, but the machine was broken that day. And my normal routine, which I had not been aware that I was doing, was it had come to be that I would leave my electronic typewriter, my word processor on all day, type things up as they came in, just, Aunt Shirley called or whatever, and call her back. And then I would take the paper, laboriously write it out by hand in what looked like the handwriting of a 5-year-old who was not feeling too well, and destroy the typescript so no one would think, know that I type things so I could laboriously, transcribe them. And these certainly were not verbatim transcriptions, because I had gone through school a lot, abbreviating and writing the least that I had to. There had been a time in school when we'd had to write a story about an animal, just create, an imaginary story about an animal we want to write about. And I'd wanted to write about dinosaurs and the Tyrannosaurus rexes and the Stegosauruses and so on. And I'd ended up writing about a dog and a cat because there was much less to write. And I really wanted to write about all the dinosaurs. Well, regardless, I was hitting bottom. You know how they say that people who are on drugs or alcohol and they get to a certain point and they hit bottom, they realize this is intolerable, I must change. I looked around. I said, I have to improve. Nothing that has been given me Nothing I could find helped me improve. And I said to myself, well, I am studying to be a librarian. I'm in New York City. As such, I have access to some of the best archival and historical libraries in the world. And I have to be there anyway for my studies. So after I go and do, my work for my classes, I'll steal a few minutes every day, go through these libraries, find out what was the entire history of our handwriting, retrace it from the beginning, find out what went wrong, keep what was right, throw away what doesn't work. In other words, if we want to think of the history of handwriting as an orchard full of all kinds of trees, imagine you pick out an orange or a coconut and you eat what's inside and you throw away the shell, the outside. I said, I'll have to do that. They've been having me swallow things that didn't work for me. And I literally did this. People probably go and study the history of our handwriting for credit, but that was not my major. I'm not sure if I was aware that there was such a field. Paleography, it's called, for those who are interested. And I literally went through and worked through everything, not only, what we know about ancient medieval writings, which obviously were difficult to apply, but when I found out that the first ever handwriting books had been published, the first ones in the Roman alphabet had been published in Europe, specifically in Italy, in the Renaissance. In other words, almost 500 years ago. Actually, the first one came out exactly 500 years ago last year. When I found these, I literally went through them. And if you look at handwriting textbooks from the Renaissance, before the cursive as we know it ever even existed, there had been many things that were called cursive before, but what was called cursive in the Renaissance? A style we today call italic, from its Italian origins. And yes, that's where the term italic, on your keyboard, come from, which was very simply a very slightly slanted, very streamlined print. It could have some decorations, but it was always very simply evident as print, where joins occurred when they were easy and not otherwise. In other words, the letter A might join into the letter P in a word like papadum, for instance. Okay, not that they had that word, but I'm trying to, pick a familiar word. But the P would not join into the A. Simply because that is a more difficult notion. It typically would not join. And in fact, the very first ever book ever published on handwriting happened to be a book of this italic style. It had been written by someone who was a scribe, in other words, a letter writer, and who worked all day, writing letters for the Catholic Church. Sort of, I think of him as sort of a human typewriter, or like the letter writers they have in some parts of the world even today, just, writing documents. And what did he have in his book at one point on this little 32-page book he had called in Italian La Operina, meaning the little work? He had a statement, and I had studied Italian, but in any case, the book has been translated into English, and I was fortunate enough to find an edition that was printed parallel, Italian original, English translation. A stunning statement. To join or to not join, I leave up to you. And I was saying there, I wish my teachers could see this. I wish my third grade teacher, my fifth grade teacher could see this. I wanted to take the book out of the library, but I couldn't. It was a reference library, Later on, I did buy some of these books and discuss them with my parents, who, well, mother practically hit the ceiling. She basically didn't even think this was real. She thought it was at one point something I was making up, and I should spend my time on something, serious, why don't you learn to bloody well write properly, Well, I went tracing through history after the Renaissance. One might say one goes for Baroque, and one could see during the Baroque era how these originally simple italic letter forms had complexified. In fact, I will show you a page from my book, which I wrote many years later. I wrote a few years ago a book called Read Cursive Fast, which literally is a book to teach people how to read cursive. And if you see this sample I'm holding up, it was possibly coming through mirrored. It looks mirrored to me, but I hope it looks straight to you. You can see a very simple G on the left side.
All a G.
So it does
like
come
all
through.
a G. I'm not wrong about that.
It all looks like a G, but if you look at the one on the left, very simple printed G, look at the one on the right, that is basically
Y.
what you've got.
You know what I think? Let me tell you. One look like A, other look like Y.
Yeah, it looks like anything
like
you could imagine. Nothing. Well, that's pretty well. If you have tip conventional North American cursive of the USA or Canada, anytime in the past several hundred years, well, see, what we did not have. No one had shown me, well, this is how it happened. No one had shown me, so to speak, the family tree. Basically, you've got the one on the left and you've got the one on the right. And if you think they're related, well, they're not, and just memorize this. Well, one of the things about people with really any or all of the conditions that I have, separately or together, is that we're not good at memorizing things unless someone shows us the pattern or we can perceive the pattern. Then we can get it instantly, better than anyone else. But if it's random, to us, learning something with no explanation is as if you had to study a language where every noun and every verb was irregular in its own different way.
Exactly.
And I assume that if there was ever such a language, it would be quite difficult to learn if one didn't grow up with it. And this is what it was. Imagine that you had to study a language where the plural of tree was airplane, and the plural of bread was cat, and the plural of knife was fork. And imagine that this held true for every word in the language. Well, that's what learning to write had been like. And now I have the key. Now, what happened? I worked on my handwriting. Secretly, I decided to put handwriting into my schoolwork. I made it better. I made a point of writing some things by hand that I did not have to. I left little notes around the house to the puzzlement of my family, who is writing this? And eventually let them, catch me at it, and started signing the notes. And it was particularly a puzzle for, my parents. I think, I think my siblings, ignored it. They certainly had their own things on their mind, their own agendas. They didn't have to worry too much about their crazy older sister. But I liked sort of puzzling my parents. I started ordering books on this because I found italic was not only a thing on the Renaissance. After the Renaissance, the Baroque, the Classical era, there had been people in the 20th century, which was still going on, it was still the 20th century, who had revived this. Many of them had written books. Some of them were still alive. Many of the books had the authors' names and addresses in there, either, either in the front material, or sometimes there were actually handwritten letters in the books from the authors or the students. And I actually got the addresses. Now, remember, I was going to libraries, and this was the age when this was before Google or white pages. When you said white pages, it was still the white pages of the telephone book, not the white pages service. That was all in the future. I would look up literally people's names and addresses in books that had been published when I was a little girl, that had not been books I had had access to, from these isolated individuals who had been reviving italic handwriting. And I would find, oh, here's someone, first name, last name, and they were living in a certain city, in a certain state. I'm in the library, and at the time, the big archival libraries actually had copies of all the telephone books from all the states and cities. So I would look in that city and, play detective. And if they weren't in that city, I'd look in other books, and then I'd say, well, if it's not there, who knows? Maybe they moved to Florida or California. A lot of people moved to nice places. And I would, especially if they had an unusual name, if it wasn't, Mary Jones or Bill Smith, if it was some memorable name, they could be found. Now, today, all of this would take 5 minutes. Back then, it took a lot of time. And mind you, I was studying. Now, alongside this, here I was not only teaching myself all about the history of handwriting, but, playing detective and not letting anyone know what I was doing. Eventually felt I was ready. And it was, and I'd been doing this in my 24th year. In other words, if your first year of life is when you're a baby, you're 0 years. I'd been doing this in my 24th year. So I said, on my 24th birthday, I'm going to come out of the handwriting closet. I'm going to tell people who's been leaving those notes. I'll write a note and I'll sign it. And at some point I did this, and I said, I'm out. I can go do this. At around that time, as it happened, the bank that I used closed. So I started an account at the new bank with my new signature. It was so opportune. Of course, otherwise I simply could have added another signature card and kept the original as because I'm sure I still had checks floating out there, In America, we still use checks, and back then it was even more so. And I surprised people. For my legal signature, I actually did change that gradually so there would be no question if people compared a signature from today with one from last month on, let's say, my classwork or something. I was a little sneaky on that. So I came out of the closet, and my folks had suggested, because they'd wondered, why on earth am I ordering all these handwriting books and these calligraphy books and this sort of thing? I said, well, here's why. And I like to say, what happened then? Well, I had been my own first student. My father, born, who was 32 years old when I was born. So I was at the time just 24. So he was now 56. He was my second student. And what happened after that? He said, "This is amazing that people did this in history. People later revived it, and you picked up on this. You've got to go and teach people." And you know what he said to do? He said, "You should write letters to doctors in hospitals. Write letters to hospitals and find which doctors are in trouble for malpractice owing to, handwriting problems that cause death or injury, and offer to come there and teach a class." Well, that's exactly what I did. But I, of course, had an idea that Dad hadn't had. He hadn't thought it would be practical. What I did was I sent them a handwritten form letter. I wrote something out by hand with, blanks, underlined blanks for the name of the hospital and the, chief of medical records. And I would fill in, to blank, blank hospital, blank, blank chief of surgery. And I Xeroxed this and just sent it out. And of course, wrote it all very nice with my calligraphy pen, because yes, by this time I was becoming a semi-professional calligrapher, and I got jobs and so literally from my 24th or 25th year for several decades, until electronic prescription became commonplace in the USA and required in most states, the doctors were my main clientele. Now it is more people like myself, people with disabilities or people without, who are going to college. Very often, handwriting teaching being as decayed as it is, they really often have never been taught to write, or not legibly, or just no one really cared. And then all of a sudden, someone realizes, oh my gosh, he's going to be out there one day. He's going to have to read something. He's going to have to write at least his name. Well, that's what I'm there for. And remember that even in our computerized age, a lot of the businesses and a lot of the colleges are actually going to handwriting in some form or another, because we have electronic slates. It can be easier to write than type. There are programs that will turn your writing into typed text if your writing's legible.
Exactly.
In schools, colleges and high schools, increasingly examinations, which at one point were more and more done electronically in colleges, universities, and some high schools, are increasingly now being done by handwriting, because it is much more difficult to cheat when you have to write this rather than,
this pen test also, this pen test, somebody can write it or not. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, because
I beg your pardon?
There's pen eligibility tests too. If you can write with pen or you can write with pencil or not. I think you might be familiar with that too. That if you can write with pen, then you can have that pen. Otherwise, you will write with pencil.
Yeah, well, definitely. Although I will tell you, for most people, pen is easier to control, but pencils have their use. I will tell you, in fact, when I use a pencil, I tend to use a mechanical pencil, what you would call a propelling pencil, but I only use certain brands. I buy the brands like Zebra or Morning Glory that have flat leads, because those are actually calligraphy pencils. You can have the thicks and thins. And one of the great things about calligraphy pens, italic pens, and the flat leaded pencils is these control your hand. It's like having the training wheels, the stabilizers, as you'd call them, on a bicycle. And having the thicks and thins actually does somewhat increase the legibility, all else being equal. So I will very often use that. My choice is to use a calligraphy pen when I can. And if I use a pencil, they tend to be things like the zebras or the iris or the morning glories that have these flat leads, just because it looks so much better. You can read it at a further distance. And I need all the help with maintaining the legibility at speed that I can. I mean, I'm a quite rapid legible writer now. I can produce on a good day 120 legible alphabet letters per minute. On a bad day, it's 100 legible alphabet letters per minute, which is pretty good, especially when you keep in mind that when I was in my 20s, it was more like 30 possibly legible alphabet letters per minute if I was copying, something. And which is not bad if you are in the first year of school or the second year of school, but good luck keeping up with a class or with your profession under any other circumstance. Well, as I was saying, since even the colleges are going back to handwritten exams just because it was too easy to cheat electronically. People were saving, they were saving pre-written text on their computers, and they were doing all sorts of, sneaky little things that, possibilities that did not, I think, exist when I was at school. I mean, we had different ways of cheating, we had our ways of cheating, or shall I say those who did them had different ways. Well, so I had been a handwriting teacher and eventually was drifting from the doctors into helping, well, just everyone, particularly those with disabilities or who had experienced other difficulties, or very often those who had been good handwriters, but cursive, as we know it, is very accident prone. That's why your handwriting deteriorates and and really gets bad no matter your efforts as you go through. Some of those letters and joins are just difficult, perhaps less so in some of the models used in Pakistan than hereabouts, but difficult enough if you think of all the letters with loops, lowercase j and, lowercase f and that sort of thing. And one of the things that's been happening is, even with people being taught cursive, quite a few people who are taught to write in cursive and required to write in cursive, which is a requirement that more and more schools are reinstituting and more states are reinstituting. A lot of them, particularly those born after 1985, where, the computer was a big thing, they learn it. They were required to learn cursive, use it perhaps at age 8, 9. And 10 years later, they have forgotten it, can't even read it. In other words, we literally have millions of young adults in the USA and in Canada, for this actually was investigated, who literally cannot read handwriting that they actually could write, at least to some extent, when they were 8. And I am convinced that this is partly because of not much exposure, but partly because they're taught to memorize it by rote, memorize everything as irregular, as a rule into itself. There's no reason for why the capital K, G is this way, why the capital Q is this way, why the lowercase f is this way. So I have spoken at educational conferences, and here's how I got into writing Read Cursive Fast. This is amazing. I was speaking about handwriting and disabilities at an educational conference for special education, and showing how I had gone from, I don't want to brag, but I do sometimes say don't know how to wow. And I've been known to show off my calligraphy to audiences. I probably won't have that much time to do it here, I don't want, I might as well. I might do something at some point just to show you that I can. But anyway, I was speaking at the conference, and a woman came up to me and she said, "Hey, is there a book about how to read cursive? And if not, could you write one?" And I think that's what she said. Either that, or she said, "Could you please write a book on how to read cursive?" I said, "Whoa, I would love to." For so many years, I thought I was the only one who couldn't. I didn't know if others, I didn't know if there'd be enough interest. I knew there was some, because of the students with whom I'd worked. Well, the woman's name was Bonnie Arnwine, Wine. She is the owner, founder, and president of National Autism Resources, the publisher of my book. And how did the book come to be published? Well, this was the book I wrote. And as I worked with Bonnie, I found out she was 51 years old at the time. She was born 5 years later than I was. So she was born in 1968. I was born in 1963.
Mhm.
And she, like me, was dyslexic, did not have, I think, other issues, but had been diagnosed in childhood, had gone through, had gone through everything. Okay, she had gone through, a lot of remediation and stuff, really, none of which had really worked. I'm just taking some notes. I'm actually also going to be writing out her name, as it's an uncommon one. So I'll get to write it out, and then you'll see my writing, you'll see your name. And among other things, her handwriting was really not quite good at all. And she was aware of this. She did get by, but she absolutely could not read cursive. Her self-report to me was exactly what mine was to everyone else when I was growing up until I was 24, and no one had believed me. And yes, I had gathered how to write cursive through seeing how cursive had come to be. But until then, I thought of cursive as basically, when I looked at it, it had looked like basically, scribbles like this. By the way, this is my letterhead that I designed, by the way. So, and this was still her experience. So we decided that the test of whether my book was any good, well, certainly we would test it on other people, but we had to test it on her. Mm-hmm. So as she worked with me on the book, just reading through it and working on the rough draft, by the time she got to the last page of what turned out to be a 138 page, quite slim book. You can see how small this is and how thin. It's about, the size of, a little cookbook you might buy at a newsstand. And it's about as thick as, Newsweek or Time. Well, by the time we had finished the end of the book, she was reading cursive. Boom. 51 years, 51 years old, and she couldn't read it. And then from reading a book, she was reading cursive, which is, which freaked her out, I think. And it freaks out a lot of people because
it's amazing. One of the somebody who cannot read and write.
Yeah, well, remember the book explained not only how to, the book showed how it came to be. It wasn't just memorize this letter, memorize this letter, memorize this letter. Okay, by the way, for those who want to see what this was my publisher's name, and her company is National Autism Resources.com. Mm-hmm. Go there and buy that book. Okay. By the way, I would like nothing better than to sell the rights in other countries, and she has indicated that she will be, that she will be open to that. We're thinking later this year, we have interest from people in a couple of other countries. And I'm not going to say anything, but let's just say, I don't want to say what countries, but it would be marvelous if Pakistan was one of them, because Pakistan is neighbor to one of the countries where someone is showing an interest. And of course, in Pakistan and many other countries, people study English from quite an early age. In case you don't know, I mean, your own English is excellent, barring the occasional pronunciation slip, but you're very well.
I did a lot of effort over that. You don't know. I have gone through all the struggle you mentioned over here. From not able to pronounce something to be a person who is a speech therapist.
I will tell you that your pronunciation perhaps could use a little work, but I do tutor English on top of everything else, and I would be willing to do lessons for you by Zoom because I do that too. Well, one of the big reasons for inflicting join everything in cursive has been, but if they don't, write it, how will they ever be able to read it? Well, you can read a book for a couple of hours, and if it's the right book, because it's my book, you'll know it. And this is not supposed to happen. And, the two biggest arguments people have said you want to know what the three biggest arguments are. One, if they don't write it, they won't know how to read it. Good argument, except that writing something is not the only way to learn how to read it, because if it was, how could those people who are born entirely paralyzed, who do exist, learn to read anything?
Reading comes first, yes.
Write something to read it.
You show somebody a letter first. You show some object. If I talk about speech therapy perspective, first you show them letter, and they read that letter, and it's not even before letter it comes sound. So when a child is not able to connect sound with the letter, he is not able to memorize that, then he's not able to write it down.
Yeah.
There's a
And but
different
even
technology
then,
behind that.
one must certainly connect sounds and groups of letters together, certainly. And reading is a whole other field. If you want to know about, there are some very effective approaches to reading out there that are very much designed to work with dyslexics. And I know people are involved in this. Although reading is not my field, I sometimes have to teach a bit of reading as I'm, or spelling as I'm teaching handwriting. My most recent student, for instance, nearly done, is a young lady, age 12, who is diagnosed with autism, and who, although she has not been diagnosed with dyslexia or dysgraphia, she has every sign of those. I am not a doctor, I do not diagnose, but let's say, let's say that I have had to use with her techniques that are effective with my fellow dyslexics and dysgraphics. But what I mean by memorization is, if we had to write something before we read it, we would never be able to read this, because this is not normally how one is taught to write.
That is the point.
Now most people, of course, do, never realize, oh, how does this come about? Now you can actually learn, you can actually learn how capitals relate to, to lowercase. You actually can. I'm going to actually, and you can learn how different forms of lowercase relate to one another, literally by following the historical course from ancient times, to today. It's very much as, when you go into museums, I know if you go into museums or in India or Pakistan, they will very often have charts of, let's say, the Brahmi script and how it developed into the Sanskrit, Devanagari, and how it developed into various modern Indian scripts. And in Pakistan, of course, they're looking at different forms of the Arabic script, the form that's used for Urdu, forms that have been used for Persian, and relations can be demonstrated. Well, we should be doing this here. When I work with someone that's having difficulty with capitals as well as lowercase as well as cursive, you do this and it will make sense how all the A's are really one A and all the G's are really one G. Yeah. Just the variations, the emphasis. And, why could we not show them this? Because once you see the pattern, that all the G's, for instance, have a rounded bit and, and then a sort of straight bit that goes down. Once you see that, and once you see that straight bit normally ends up going to the left, you'll know which one is the G. Even if you're looking at the ridiculous American, I mean, you've seen the North American, typical North American G, and I'm going to show you the North American S. If you had like initials like a G, like let's say GS, I mean, they look practically the same.
Like
and you might,
something. It's more.
It looks odd. It's like, how would you know? When I was little, I would just say, the one on the left, I'd say the one on the right, the S looks like a duck, and the G, on the left looks like another duck.
Yeah, that looked like it could be a snake too. Because
but if you show people, you can show people almost like, this little, puzzle, find the cat. If you show them the pattern that's hidden in it, you can see right now which is the G, which is the S, and you'll never mess them up. My father mixed them up all his life. When he signed his last name, Gladstone, the first letter actually looked like a perfectly good S, because he didn't get that it was different. He didn't get that little bit in the top right corner is the important bit that makes it a G. If you're going to go into this elaborately, I have to say, unnecessarily elaborate way of writing. Now, I'm not saying get rid of this. People will write as they write. I believe we should be able to read all the kinds of writing that are out there, and we should write more legibly ourselves. In fact, if you want to see an article on handwriting issues, you can go to my well, I have more than one website. One website which is correlated with and supplements my book, Read Cursive Fast, is called readcursivefast.com. You'll see quite a few articles and quite a few links to articles. I am talking largely about reading, a little bit about writing, and you'll see a lot of articles there. I'm also going to tell you right now names of articles that if you search them with my name, those are articles relevant to discussions of dyslexia and other disabilities that will come up. I would recommend you read. Some of them are just guest blog pieces or other things I've written, for organizations that have endorsed them. This book, in fact, has several endorsements from dyslexia therapists and dyslexia organizations. Yeah, I mean, pretty good for someone who, well, I was at one point, let's just say my parents actually once admitted to me when I was a grown woman that at one point they thought that they should send me off to be institutionalized somewhere. So this is pretty good for someone who is literally, one step from the mental home at one point. But if you go to readcursivefast.com, you'll find lots of articles by me. To find more, I'm going to look up my name plus the following title: Handwriting and the Autism Spectrum. You will learn not only about me and my adventures with handwriting and autism, but you will also learn that one of the best known calligraphers in the USA, the author of the best-selling textbook on calligrapher, is himself, in fact, also autistic. I would also say, look up an article called When Readers Can't Read Cursive, again by Kate Gladstone. You want to put my name next to these articles. And you want to look up an article called When the Different Learner Meets Cursive. You also want to look up an article called Oops, I Forgot How to Read Cursive. Now that one is the one I hand out to people who say, oh, well, if we only mandated cursive, everything would be magical and all you dyslexic people would vanish and you'd be all normal, like the rest of us, and not have problems and not need, even want anything to be made simpler. Well, what I point out is even people without disabilities in places that mandate cursive and have done so for years, we'll look at the example of Canada, which is what the article is about. The article cites and links to an investigation that was done in the year 2013 by Canada's largest newspaper, the Toronto Star. The investigation looked at college freshmen, as we call in North America, the first-year college students we call freshmen. So college first-year students, some of whom came from the province of Alberta, where at that time there really had always been mandated cursive, from a very early stage of education. Some of them came from other provinces where cursive has simply, not been taught during the lifetime of these first-year students. These students were examined and were compared with regard to their skill, not in any college subject, but can they read cursive, and write it. And the amazing thing was that these students, whether they had lots of cursive, from age 8 onward, all through their schooling, or they had none at all, by the time they were 18 and, being scrutinized for their ability to read and write cursive, most of them in both groups could not write it, let alone could not, and certainly they could not read it, let alone write it. Very, very few of them did. Many of them had memories. Oh yeah, I used to know how to write this. I used to know how to write my name in cursive, and I used to be able to read this. In other words, you've literally got millions of people walking around Canada, and it's much the same situation in the USA, where the culture and education are very similar, who literally cannot read things that 10 years previously they used to know how to write, at least to some extent. And, and these are people by and large without disabilities. So think, what is the situation for those of us with? But then perhaps people will say, oh, but cursive is so flowing and nice and it's so smooth and gives you motor control. Even if that is the case, if what you're doing is not able to be this continually joiny, loopy thing, well, then what you're doing is perhaps not the thing that's supposed to be so great for you. And even if it is, people will say, but it flows and you never pick up. And so that's why you won't have the reversals. I say, but you do. The first diagnosed ever case of dyslexia, called at the time congenital word blindness, which was the name of it for many decades, was diagnosed in the late 18th century by a doctor who submitted the case report to the British Medical Journal. And that journal printed an extensive coverage of this young fellow in,